The photograph appeared on a Tuesday afternoon, unremarkable in its arrival, but devastating in its implications. Someone with the username Wanderlust Archives had posted it to a photography forum dedicated to urban exploration, a simple caption beneath: "Abandoned seaside inn, location withheld per community rules." The image showed a corridor thick with dust, wallpaper peeling like dried skin, and in the background, barely visible through a doorway, what appeared to be personal belongings arranged on a desk: a passport, a pair of glasses, a journal with a distinctive emerald cover. Detective Von Tessler had been scrolling through his phone during his lunch break when the tip came through. A woman named Iris Chadwick, now in her 60s, had seen the photograph shared on a true crime discussion board. She had recognized the journal immediately. It had belonged to her niece, Marlo Fenwick, who had vanished without explanation in the summer of 2008, 14 years earlier, in the coastal town of Portland. Vaughn put down his sandwich and read the message again. Then he read it a third time. He had been with the Portland Police Department for nearly 2 decades, but he had been a rookie patrolman when Marlo Fenwick disappeared. He remembered the case vaguely, the way you remember a song you heard once in passing: a missing tourist, no body, no suspects, no resolution. The kind of case that gets filed away when leads dry up and the family stops calling. But now there was this photograph. He forwarded the image to the department's digital forensics team and made a note to contact Iris Chadwick directly. Then he pulled up the original case file, a digital scan of yellowed paper reports and grainy photographs from an era just before everything went fully electronic. The face that looked back at him from the missing person poster was young and bright, a woman in her late 20s with dark hair pulled back in a casual bun, brown eyes that seemed both curious and cautious. Marlo Fenwick, age 29. Last seen entering the intersection of Harlow Street and Beacon Avenue at approximately 11:47 in the evening on July 16, 2008. The file was thinner than it should have been. Vaughn flipped through the scanned pages, his eyes moving quickly over the details. Marlo had been visiting Portland alone, a solo trip she had planned after finishing a graduate program in cultural anthropology back in England. She had booked a small room at the Mariner's Rest, a modest hotel 3 blocks from the waterfront. According to the original investigation, she had spent her days exploring the town, photographing the old lighthouse, eating at local cafes, journaling in the park overlooking the harbor. On the night she disappeared, she had attended a summer concert series at the pavilion near the boardwalk. Witnesses recalled seeing her there, sitting alone on a bench with a notebook in her lap, tapping her foot to the music. The band had been a local jazz ensemble, popular with tourists and residents alike. When the concert ended around 11:15, Marlo had been seen walking east along the boardwalk, heading in the general direction of her hotel. But she never arrived. The security camera at the boardwalk entrance captured her at 11:39. She was walking at a steady pace, her hands in the pockets of a light jacket, her expression unreadable in the grainy footage. 8 minutes later, another camera at the corner of Harlow and Beacon showed her turning left onto Beacon Avenue, a narrow street lined with closed storefronts and old row houses. It was a street she had no apparent reason to visit. Her hotel was in the opposite direction. There were no restaurants open at that hour, no attractions, no shortcuts that would make sense. And after that, nothing. The original investigators had canvassed the area. They had knocked on doors, reviewed footage from nearby businesses, interviewed anyone who might have been out that night. No one had seen her. No one had heard anything unusual. It was as if she had walked into that street and simply ceased to exist. Her aunt, Iris Chadwick, had flown in from England 3 days after the disappearance. She had stayed for 2 weeks, posting flyers, speaking to the media, pleading for anyone with information to come forward. Vaughn found a photograph of her in the file, A woman with Marlowe's same dark hair, streaked with gray, her face lined with worry and exhaustion. She had told investigators that Marlowe was responsible, careful, not the kind of person to wander off without telling anyone. She had no history of mental illness, no debts, no enemies. She was simply a young woman on a holiday, enjoying a quiet town by the sea. The investigation had eventually stalled. Without a body, without evidence of foul play, without any leads that went anywhere, the case had been moved to inactive status. Iris had returned to England. The media had moved on. Portland had moved on. Marlowe Fenwick became another name in a database, another unsolved mystery tucked away in a filing cabinet. Until now. Vaughn printed out the photograph from the forum and studied it closely. The corridor in the image was clearly abandoned, the kind of decay that takes years to accumulate. The wallpaper was faded and torn, the floorboards warped and discolored. But it was the items in the background that held his attention. The passport on the desk was partially open, its cover a deep burgundy. The glasses were wire-rimmed, delicate. The journal was unmistakably emerald green with a leather strap wrapped around it. He picked up his phone and dialed Iris Chadwick's number, which she had included in her message. She answered on the second ring. Her voice was steady, but carried the weight of 14 years of unanswered questions. She confirmed that the journal in the photograph matched the one Marlowe had brought with her on the trip. She had bought it for her as a gift before she left, a travel journal for her to document her experiences. The passport was correct, too. Marlowe had been meticulous about keeping her important documents together. Vaughn asked her if she had any idea where the photograph might have been taken. Iris said she had been searching online for hours, trying to identify the location, but the person who posted it had refused to share specifics, citing the urban exploration community's policy of not revealing sites to prevent vandalism and trespassing. Vaughn thanked her and promised to follow up. Then he began his own search. He reached out to the username Wanderlust Archives through the forum's messaging system, identifying himself as law enforcement and requesting information regarding an ongoing investigation. He received a reply within an hour. The user, who identified himself only as Garrett, was cooperative but cautious. He explained that he had taken the photograph 3 weeks earlier while exploring abandoned properties along the southern coast. He had been documenting forgotten places for a personal project. He had entered the building through an unsecured side door and spent about an hour inside before leaving. He had not touched anything. He had not realized the significance of what he had photographed until someone on the forum pointed out that the items in the background appeared to belong to a missing person. Garrett agreed to share the location on the condition that it would not be made public. He provided GPS coordinates and a brief description. The building was the old Seaside Inn, a hotel that had been closed since 2009, about a year after Marlowe's disappearance. It was located on a stretch of coastal road about 12 miles south of Portland, isolated and forgotten, its windows boarded up, its parking lot cracked and overgrown with weeds. Vaughn felt a chill run through him. 12 miles south. Not far, but far enough that it would not have been part of the original search radius. The investigation had focused on Portland itself, on the streets Marlowe had walked, the places she had visited. No one had thought to look outside the town, especially not at a hotel that had still been operational at the time of her disappearance. He printed out a map and marked the location. Then he assembled a small team. He wanted to approach this carefully, methodically. If Marlowe's belongings were still there after 14 years, untouched, then there was a chance that other evidence remained as well, evidence that might finally explain what had happened to her. The following morning, Vaughn and 3 other officers drove south along the coastal highway. The day was overcast, the sky a uniform gray that blended with the sea. They passed through small towns and stretches of empty beach, the landscape quiet and windswept. The Seaside Inn appeared suddenly around a curve, a three-story structure of faded blue paint and rotting wood, set back from the road behind a chain-link fence that had partially collapsed. They parked at the entrance and approached on foot. The front doors were padlocked, but as Garrett had described, there was a side entrance where the door hung loose on its hinges. Vaughn pushed it open and stepped inside. The air was thick with the smell of mold and decay. The lobby was a ruin of overturned furniture and water-stained carpet. The front desk was still intact, its surface covered in dust and debris. A faded painting of a seascape hung crooked on the wall. They moved carefully through the ground floor, documenting everything with photographs and notes. The hotel had clearly been abandoned in haste. There were still linens in the storage closets, dishes in the kitchen, files in the back office. It was as if the owners had simply locked the doors one day and never returned. The corridor from the photograph was on the second floor. Vaughn recognized it immediately from the wallpaper pattern, a faded floral design that had once been cheerful but now looked sinister in its neglect. He walked slowly down the hall, his footsteps echoing in the silence, until he reached the doorway visible in the image. The room beyond was small, a former guest room stripped of its bed and furniture except for a single wooden desk pushed against the wall beneath the window, and there, exactly as they had appeared in the photograph, were Marlowe Fenwick's belongings. Vaughn felt his breath catch. He had worked dozens of cases over the years, had seen evidence in all forms, but there was something profoundly unsettling about seeing these items here, arranged so carefully, preserved in this abandoned place for so long. He pulled on a pair of gloves and approached the desk. The passport was open to the identification page. Marlowe's photograph stared up at him, her expression neutral and official. The glasses were folded neatly beside it. The journal was closed, the leather strap wrapped tightly around it. He carefully opened the journal. The pages were filled with Marlowe's handwriting, neat and precise, documenting her days in Portland. He flipped through slowly, reading fragments, descriptions of the lighthouse, notes about the food she had tried, sketches of buildings and boats. The entries were cheerful, reflective, the writings of someone enjoying their solitude and the freedom of travel. The final entry was dated July 16, 2008, the night she disappeared. It was longer than the others, written in a slightly shakier hand, as if she had been writing quickly or with some distress. Vaughn read it carefully, his team gathering behind him to look over his shoulder. Marlowe described the concert, the music, the pleasant evening by the water. But then the tone shifted. She wrote about noticing someone watching her during the performance. A man, she thought, though she could not be sure in the dim light. She had felt uneasy but had dismissed it as paranoia. After the concert, she had started walking back to her hotel but had realized someone was following her. She had turned onto Beacon Avenue, hoping to lose them, hoping to find someone else, another person on the street, a store that might still be open. The entry ended abruptly mid-sentence. Vaughn turned the page, but the rest of the journal was blank. He closed it carefully and looked around the room. There were no signs of a struggle, no evidence of violence, just these belongings placed here intentionally, almost reverently. He stepped back and tried to piece it together. Marlowe had been followed. She had turned onto Beacon Avenue, away from her hotel, seeking help or escape. And somehow she had ended up here, at this hotel 12 miles outside of town. But how? And why had no one found her? Vaughn instructed his team to process the entire building. They would document every room, every surface, search for any trace of Marlowe or anyone else who might have been here. He returned to the lobby and stood in the dim light filtering through the boarded windows, trying to imagine what had happened that night 14 years ago. The Seaside Inn had been operational in 2008. That meant staff, guests, records. He made a note to track down the ownership history, to find anyone who had worked here during that time. Someone had to know something. As his team worked, Vaughn walked the perimeter of the building, studying the landscape. The hotel was isolated, surrounded by scrub grass and windswept trees. The nearest neighbor was over a mile away. It would have been the perfect place to bring someone if you did not want to be seen. He returned inside and climbed to the third floor, which had once housed additional guest rooms and a small event space. Most of the doors were locked or jammed shut, but one at the end of the hall was ajar. He pushed it open and found himself in a room that had clearly been used for storage. Boxes were stacked against the walls, their contents spilling out: old linens, cleaning supplies, files, and paperwork. He began sifting through the boxes, looking for anything that might be relevant. Most of it was mundane, records of inventory and maintenance. But then, near the bottom of one box, he found a ledger, a guest registration book from 2008. He carried it downstairs into better light and began flipping through the pages. The entries were handwritten, names and dates and room numbers recorded in a neat script. He scanned through July, his finger tracing down the columns, and then he stopped. There, on the night of July 16th, was a single entry, room 214. No name, just a notation in different handwriting, hastily scrawled: emergency booking, paid cash, room 214. Vaughn looked up at the ceiling, calculating. That would be on the second floor, near the room where Marlowe's belongings had been found. He climbed the stairs again, his pulse quickening, and found the door marked 214. It was locked, but the wood was old and weakened. One of the officers forced it open with a crowbar. The room beyond was empty. The bed frame was still there, stripped bare. The curtains hung in tatters, but the air felt different here, heavier, as if the room itself remembered something terrible. Vaughn stepped inside and looked around carefully. His eyes caught on something near the baseboard beneath the window: scratches, faint but deliberate, carved into the wood. He knelt down and examined them closely. They were letters, barely visible, etched with something sharp. A key, perhaps, or a piece of metal. "Help me." And beneath that, a single word: Marlowe. The scratches in the wood seemed to pulse with urgency even after 14 years. Vaughn remained kneeling beside the baseboard, his flashlight beam fixed on those desperate letters, while his team photographed and documented everything in the room. He felt the weight of all those lost years pressing down on him. The knowledge that Marlowe Fenwick had been here, in this very space, calling out for help that never came. Detective Sarah Chen, the forensics specialist who had accompanied them, carefully took scrapings from around the carved letters, hoping to find trace evidence that might have survived. She worked with the precision of someone who understood that, after this much time, they might only have one chance to recover whatever remained. The room was processed inch by inch, the team moving with quiet intensity, each of them aware that they were standing in a place where something terrible had happened. Vaughn stood and walked to the window. The boards covering it from the outside allowed only thin strips of gray light to penetrate. He tried to imagine what Marlowe would have seen if she had looked out, whether she had watched the road hoping for rescue, whether she had seen her captor coming and going. The view would have shown the empty stretch of coastal highway, the distant line where land met sea, the isolation that made this place so perfectly suited for concealment. The guest ledger troubled him. An emergency booking with no name, paid in cash on the exact night Marlowe disappeared. It was too precise to be coincidence, yet it raised more questions than it answered. The Seaside Inn had been a functioning business at that time, with staff and presumably other guests. How had no one noticed anything unusual? How had someone managed to bring Marlowe here and keep her in this room without anyone being aware? He returned downstairs to examine the office more thoroughly. Behind the reception desk, he found file cabinets that still contained employment records and business documents from the hotel's final years of operation. The metal drawers screeched in protest as he pulled them open, revealing folders thick with paperwork that had begun to yellow and curl at the edges. He started sorting through them systematically, looking for anything related to July 2008. The hotel's ownership during that period had belonged to a man named Edward Pritchard, according to the business licenses and tax documents Vaughn found. The records indicated that Pritchard had run the Seaside Inn for nearly 15 years, before closing it abruptly in March of 2009. There was a notice from the county about unpaid property taxes, letters from creditors, and finally, a foreclosure notice dated October 2009. The property had been tied up in legal proceedings for years after that, passing through various hands but never reopening. Vaughn made notes of every name he found: staff members who had worked at the hotel, vendors who had supplied it, contractors who had done repairs. Each one would need to be tracked down and interviewed. He found a staff schedule from July 2008 and photographed every page. There had been 3 people working the night Marlowe disappeared: a desk clerk named Rita Holmgren, a maintenance worker named Joseph Torres, and a manager named Diane Cutter, who had apparently been covering a shift. He called back to the station and asked them to run background checks on all 3 names, along with Edward Pritchard. Then he requested that someone pull together everything they could find about why the Seaside Inn had closed so suddenly. Businesses did not usually shut their doors overnight unless something significant had happened. As afternoon faded into evening, the team finished processing the 2nd floor and moved to the 3rd. Vaughn remained in the office, going through every piece of paper he could find. He discovered financial records that showed the hotel had been struggling for years, operating at a loss, kept afloat by occasional influxes of cash that were not well documented. There were gaps in the bookkeeping, periods where no records existed at all, which struck him as unusual for any legitimate business. His phone rang just as the light outside was beginning to dim. It was Detective Marcus Webb from the station, calling with preliminary information about the names he had requested. Rita Holmgren had moved to California in 2010 and had passed away from cancer in 2016. Joseph Torres had relocated to Nevada and was currently working as a building superintendent in Las Vegas. Diane Cutter still lived in the area, just north of Portland in a small town called Ferndale. She was now in her late 60s and worked part-time at a garden center. Edward Pritchard was more difficult to locate. The last official record of him was from 2012, a change of address form filed with the post office indicating he had moved to Florida. After that, the trail went cold. No employment records, no tax filings, no property ownership. Either he had been living very quietly, or he had been using a different identity. Vaughn thanked Webb and decided that Diane Cutter would be their first interview. She was local, accessible, and as the manager on duty that night, she would have had the most complete picture of what had been happening at the hotel. He made arrangements to visit her the following morning, then gathered his team and secured the Seaside Inn, posting an officer outside to ensure the scene remained undisturbed. The drive back to Portland felt longer than it had that morning. Vaughn watched the coastline pass in the growing darkness, thinking about Marlowe Fenwick and how close they had been to finding her 14 years ago. 12 miles. That was all that had separated her from the search teams, from her aunt, from rescue. It seemed impossibly cruel that such a small distance could mean the difference between life and death, between resolution and endless uncertainty. Diane Cutter lived in a modest ranch house with a well-maintained garden that suggested she took her work seriously even outside business hours. She answered the door wearing dirt-stained jeans and a flannel shirt, her gray hair pulled back in a ponytail, her face lined but pleasant. When Vaughn introduced himself and explained why he had come, her expression shifted immediately from friendly curiosity to something that looked like recognition tinged with dread. She invited them inside without hesitation, leading them to a living room crowded with plants and comfortable furniture. She offered coffee, which Vaughn accepted, and they sat across from each other while Detective Chen took notes beside him. Diane remembered the night of July 16, 2000, and ate without needing to check any records. Her voice was steady, but carried the weight of something she had been carrying for a long time. She explained that it had been an unusual evening from the start. The regular manager had called in sick, so she had come in to cover the overnight shift. The hotel had been quiet, only about half full, mostly long-term guests who were working on construction projects in the area. Around midnight, a man had arrived at the front desk asking about a room. She described him as somewhere in his 40s, average height, clean cut, wearing casual clothes that looked expensive. He had been polite but insistent, saying he had been driving all night and needed a place to rest. He paid cash for one night, did not provide identification despite her request, and said he would only be staying a few hours. She had reluctantly given him room 214 because it was at the far end of the hall, and she thought he would be less likely to disturb the other guests. Vaughn asked if she had seen anyone with him. Diane paused before answering, her hands wrapped around her coffee mug. She said she had not seen anyone at that time, but approximately an hour later, she had gone upstairs to deliver extra towels to another guest and had heard voices coming from room 214. A man's voice and what might have been a woman's voice, though she could not be certain. The walls were thin in that old building. She had not thought much of it at the time, assumed perhaps he had made a phone call or turned on the television. When she returned to the front desk, the man had been waiting for her. He asked about checkout procedures and said he would be leaving early in the morning before the desk opened again. He seemed anxious, kept checking his watch, kept glancing toward the stairs. She told him he could just leave the key in the room and she would handle the rest. He thanked her and went back upstairs, and that was the last time she saw him. The next morning, when the day shift clerk went to check room 214, the door was unlocked and the room was empty. The key was on the nightstand. There was no sign anyone had slept there. The bed was still made, the towels unused. The clerk had mentioned it to Diane when she came in that evening, said it seemed strange, but they had chalked it up to an eccentric guest and moved on. Vaughn asked why she had never come forward during the investigation into Marlowe's disappearance. Diane's face tightened. She explained that she had not made the connection at the time. The investigation had been focused on Portland itself, and no one had ever asked questions about the Seaside Inn. By the time she saw news reports about the missing tourist weeks later, it had seemed too late to mention a guest who had stayed for only a few hours and left without incident. She had convinced herself it was not relevant, that she would be wasting police time with information that led nowhere. But she had never forgotten that night. The way the man had acted, the voices she had heard, the empty room the next morning. When the hotel closed the following year, she had felt a sense of relief mixed with guilt, as if by leaving that place behind she could also leave behind the nagging feeling that something had been very wrong. Vaughn asked if she remembered what the man looked like well enough to work with a sketch artist. Diane nodded slowly. She said his face had stayed with her all these years, showing up sometimes in dreams, a constant reminder of the night she had failed to ask the right questions. They arranged for her to come to the station the following day. Before they left, Vaughn asked one more question. Did she know why Edward Pritchard had closed the hotel so suddenly? Diane's expression darkened. She said that Pritchard had always run the Seaside Inn on the margins of legality, renting rooms by the hour to people who did not want their names recorded, looking the other way when suspicious activities occurred. In early 2009, there had been rumors that police were investigating the hotel in connection with various crimes, though nothing had ever been made public. Pritchard had shut everything down almost overnight, dismissed the staff with minimal notice, and disappeared. She had suspected he was running from something, but she had never known what. As Vaughn and Chen drove back to Portland, they discussed what they had learned. The picture was becoming clearer but also more disturbing. The Seaside Inn had been a place where people went when they wanted to avoid scrutiny, and someone had used that to their advantage the night Marlowe disappeared. The man Diane described had brought Marlowe to that room, kept her there against her will, and then vanished, leaving behind only her belongings arranged on a desk like evidence meant to be found someday. The sketch artist session with Diane Cutter produced a composite image that was distributed immediately to local and national databases. The face showed a man with regular features, nothing particularly distinctive, the kind of person who could blend into a crowd without being noticed. It was both helpful and frustrating, detailed enough to be useful but generic enough that it could match thousands of men. Joseph Torres, the maintenance worker, was interviewed by phone from Las Vegas. His memory of that night was less specific than Diane's. He remembered being called to fix a radiator in one of the ground floor rooms and spending most of his shift dealing with a plumbing issue in the basement. He had not seen the mystery guest, had not been aware of anything unusual happening. He confirmed that the Seaside Inn had been the kind of place where management did not encourage staff to pay too much attention to who was coming and going. The search for Edward Pritchard intensified. Financial investigators traced his movements after leaving Oregon and found that he had indeed relocated to Florida, specifically to a suburb of Tampa, where he had worked briefly for a property management company under his own name. But in 2013, all records ceased. No death certificate, no forwarding address, no activity on his Social Security number. It was as if he had simply evaporated. One investigator suggested that Pritchard might have assumed a new identity, possibly because he was fleeing debts or legal troubles. Another theory was that he had died under circumstances that were never officially recorded. Either way, locating him became a priority. If anyone knew what had truly happened at the Seaside Inn during its final years, it would be the man who had owned it. Meanwhile, forensics continued to process evidence from room 214. The scrapings from around Marlowe's carved message yielded traces of skin cells that were sent for DNA analysis. Though after 14 years of exposure to fluctuating temperatures and moisture, the likelihood of obtaining a usable profile was uncertain. The room itself was tested for blood evidence using luminol, and several small areas reacted positively, though the patterns were inconclusive and degraded. Marlowe's belongings were examined minutely. The journal was sent to a document specialist who analyzed the handwriting throughout, confirming that all entries appeared to be written by the same person, and that there were no signs of forgery or coercion in the earlier entries. The final entry, however, showed characteristics of stress writing, the letters less controlled, the pressure inconsistent, exactly what would be expected from someone writing in fear. The passport and glasses were tested for fingerprints. Several partial prints were recovered, most of them belonging to Marlowe herself, but there were also 2 unidentified prints on the passport cover that did not match anyone in the criminal database. Those prints were preserved and catalogued, waiting for the day they might find a match. As the investigation expanded, Vaughn reached out to Iris Chadwick in England to update her on what they had found. The conversation was difficult. Iris listened in silence as he described the room, the carved message, the evidence that Marlowe had been held at the Seaside Inn. When he finished, there was a long pause before she spoke. Her voice was thick with emotion but remained steady. She thanked him for not giving up, for treating Marlowe as more than just a cold case number. She said she had always known something terrible had happened, had felt it in her bones, but having confirmation somehow made it both worse and better. Worse because hope was now replaced by certainty. Better because Marlowe's story was finally being told. Iris mentioned something Vaughn had not known. In the months after Marlowe's disappearance, she had hired a private investigator, a man named Colin Driscoll who specialized in missing persons cases. Driscoll had worked the case for almost a year before Iris ran out of money to pay him. He had followed leads that the police had not pursued, had interviewed people who had been overlooked, had been convinced that Marlowe had not simply wandered off or chosen to disappear. Iris did not know if Driscoll was still working as an investigator, but she provided Vaughn with the last contact information she had for him. Vaughn tracked down Colin Driscoll to a small office in Seattle. Now in his early 70s, Driscoll still took occasional cases but had mostly retired. When Vaughn explained who he was and why he was calling, Driscoll's response was immediate. He had never forgotten Marlowe Fenwick. Her case had been one of the ones that haunted him, that he returned to in quiet moments, wondering what he had missed. They arranged to meet, and Driscoll drove down to Portland 2 days later, carrying boxes of files he had accumulated during his investigation. He spread everything across the conference table in the station, years of work preserved in notebooks and folders. Driscoll had pursued angles the police had not considered. He had researched similar disappearances in the region, looking for patterns. He had found 3 other cases within a 100-mile radius over the previous decade, where women traveling alone had vanished under circumstances that shared similarities with Marlowe's. None had ever been solved. One case in particular stood out. In 2004, a woman named Rebecca Solis had disappeared while visiting the coast near Astoria. She had last been seen leaving a restaurant alone, heading toward her car in a parking lot. Witnesses reported seeing a man approach her, engaging her in conversation, walking with her toward the vehicles. The next day, her car was found abandoned on a logging road 30 miles away. Rebecca was never found. The man in the parking lot was never identified. Driscoll had obtained a description of that man from the witnesses, and had even worked with a sketch artist at the time. He pulled out the drawing now and placed it beside the composite Diane Cutter had helped create. The resemblance was not exact, but there were enough similarities to suggest they could be the same person. Same general age, same build, same unremarkable features that made him easy to forget. Vaughn felt a chill. If this was the same person, then they were not looking at a single incident but a pattern of predatory behavior spanning years. He contacted the detectives who had worked the Rebecca Solis case and requested all their files. Then he reached out to the other jurisdictions where similar disappearances had occurred. Over the following weeks, a task force was assembled. Investigators from multiple agencies began sharing information, comparing notes, looking for connections. The cases shared enough similarities to suggest a single perpetrator, women traveling alone, disappearing after being approached by a man who seemed helpful or friendly, vehicles found abandoned in remote locations, no bodies ever recovered. The Seaside Inn became a focal point. Its location between several of the disappearance sites, its operation as a place that avoided scrutiny, its sudden closure in 2009, all suggested it had played a role in more than just Marlowe's case. The task force obtained warrants to conduct ground-penetrating radar surveys of the property surrounding the hotel, searching for any indication of burials. The surveys were conducted over 3 days, teams moving systematically across the overgrown grounds, mapping anomalies beneath the surface. Several areas showed disturbances consistent with excavation, though not all of them would necessarily be related to the investigation. Old properties like this often had underground storage, septic systems, and utilities that could create false positives. The decision was made to excavate the most promising locations. It was a delicate process, archaeologists working alongside forensic specialists, removing soil layer by layer, screening everything, preserving any potential evidence. The media got wind of the operation and descended on the site, satellite trucks lining the highway, reporters broadcasting live updates, speculation running wild about what might be found. Vaughn tried to maintain focus despite the circus atmosphere. He understood the public interest, but also knew that every camera, every shouted question, every sensational headline made the investigation more complicated. Families of missing persons from across the region were calling the tip line, hoping for answers about their own loved ones, each one representing years of pain and uncertainty. The first excavation yielded nothing but old trash and construction debris. The second location was similarly disappointing, but on the third day, working in an area northeast of the hotel near a collapsed shed, the team uncovered something. Fabric first, deteriorated but unmistakably clothing, buried approximately 3 feet below the surface. The excavation slowed to a painstaking crawl. Brushes and tools replaced shovels. Photographs documented every stage. And then, beneath the fabric, they found bones. The medical examiner was called to the site. Dr. Patricia Lowell arrived within an hour and personally supervised the recovery. The remains were human. That much was immediately clear, but determining identity would require laboratory analysis. The bones were carefully removed, placed in containers, transported to the morgue where they would be cleaned, examined, and compared against dental records and DNA from missing persons cases. The media frenzy intensified. Vaughn held a brief press conference confirming only that human remains had been found and that the investigation was ongoing. He refused to speculate about identity or cause of death. Behind the scenes, the task force waited anxiously for results from Dr. Lowell's examination. 3 days later, they had preliminary findings. The remains were female, estimated age between 25 and 35, approximate height 5 feet 6 inches. The bones showed no obvious signs of trauma, but Dr. Lowell cautioned that soft tissue injuries would not be visible after this much time, and that some types of violence left no skeletal evidence. Time of death was impossible to determine precisely, but based on decomposition and the condition of the clothing, the remains had been buried for at least 10 years. Dental records were compared against missing persons cases. The task force held its collective breath as the odontologist worked through the comparisons, and then the answer came. The remains were not Marlo Fenwick. They belonged to Rebecca Solis, the woman who had disappeared near Astoria in 2004. The news hit Vaughn hard, a mixture of emotions he struggled to process. Relief that Marlo had not been found in that grave, guilt about feeling relieved when another family was receiving the worst possible confirmation, and renewed determination to find answers for everyone involved. Rebecca's family was notified, and while they grieved, they also expressed gratitude that after 19 years, they finally knew what had happened to her. But the discovery raised urgent questions. If Rebecca had been buried at the Seaside Inn, then the location had been used by her killer as a disposal site. And if one victim was buried there, were there others? The ground-penetrating radar surveys were expanded, covering more of the property, and 2 additional anomalies were identified. The excavations continued. The media attention never wavered, and 1 week later they found another grave. This set of remains was also female, similar age range, buried in similar fashion but in a different location on the property. The condition suggested approximately the same time frame, possibly even the same year. Again, Dr. Lowell conducted a thorough examination. Again, dental records were compared. The second victim was identified as Jennifer Ames, a woman who had disappeared in 2006 while hiking alone in the Cascades. Her case had been classified as a probable accident, the assumption being that she had fallen or become lost in the wilderness. No one had connected her disappearance to any other cases. No one had looked for her anywhere near the coast. The task force now faced the grim reality that they were dealing with a serial predator who had used the seaside inn as his hunting ground for years. The urgency to find Edward Pritchard intensified. He was either directly involved or had been complicit in allowing these crimes to occur on his property. But Marlowe's remains were still not found. The excavations uncovered no additional graves despite extensive searching. Her belongings had been in that room, her message carved into the wood, but her body was not buried on the grounds. The question became, why had she been treated differently? Had she escaped? Had she been taken somewhere else? Was she still alive? Vaughn did not believe she was alive. Everything about the scene suggested finality, evidence carefully preserved rather than hastily abandoned. Someone had wanted those belongings found eventually, had arranged them with purpose. The carved message felt like a memorial, not a call for rescue. As weeks turned into months, the investigation began to follow new leads. Financial records for Edward Pritchard were examined going back decades, and a pattern emerged. The Seaside Inn had been purchased in the early 90s with money that had no clear source. Pritchard had owned other properties over the years, small hotels and rental houses, always in isolated locations, always operated with minimal oversight. Several had been closed following complaints from neighbors or visits from law enforcement, though no charges had ever been filed. A forensic accountant traced movements of money that suggested Pritchard had been involved in activities well beyond legitimate hotel management. There were payments to individuals with criminal records, transfers to offshore accounts, purchases that made no business sense. The Seaside Inn appeared to have been less a functioning hotel and more a facade for other operations. Then came the break they had been waiting for. A fingerprint analyst reviewing evidence from the hotel found a partial print on the guest ledger, on the page where the July 16th entry had been made. The print did not belong to Diane Cutter, whose prints were on file for elimination purposes. It did not belong to any of the known staff members, but it did match one of the unidentified prints found on Marlowe's passport. The print was run through expanded databases, including international records, and this time it found a match. The fingerprint belonged to a man named Raymond Haskell, who had a criminal record in Florida dating back to the early 2000s. His offenses included fraud, assault, and stalking. He had served 2 years in prison from 2009 to 2011, and after his release, he had moved frequently, never staying in one place for long. The timing was significant. Haskell had entered the Florida prison system just months after the Seaside Inn closed. Whatever had happened in Oregon, it had apparently driven him to flee across the country, where he had been caught committing other crimes. Current whereabouts for Raymond Haskell were unknown. His last known address was in Georgia from 2018, but he had not renewed his lease and had left no forwarding information. An arrest warrant was issued, and his photograph was distributed to law enforcement agencies nationwide, along with the composite sketches that resembled him closely enough to suggest he had been the mystery guest at the Seaside Inn. Vaughn stared at Haskell's mugshot, trying to see behind the eyes of this man who had taken so much from so many families. The face was ordinary, the kind you would pass on the street without noticing, and perhaps that was his greatest weapon. He looked like no one, remembered by no one, invisible in his cruelty. The search for Haskell expanded internationally. Interpol was contacted. Border crossings were flagged. Every tip that came in was followed up, though most led nowhere. Months passed with no solid sightings, and the investigation settled into the frustrating rhythm of waiting for the next break. During this time, Vaughn continued working other aspects of the case. He reviewed every piece of evidence again, looking for anything that had been missed. He interviewed more people who had been connected to the Seaside Inn, trying to understand how Haskell had known about the place, what his relationship with Pritchard had been, whether they had been working together. One former employee, a housekeeper named Maria Gutierrez who had worked at the hotel briefly in 2007, provided a crucial piece of information. She remembered a man who had visited Pritchard regularly at the hotel, someone who had seemed to have access to rooms without going through the front desk. She described him as polite but unsettling, someone who watched people too closely. When shown Haskell's photograph, she identified him immediately as the man she remembered. This confirmed what Vaughn had suspected. Haskell had not been a random guest who happened upon the seaside inn. He had been a regular presence there, someone who knew the property, who had arrangement with Pritchard, who had used the location repeatedly for his crimes. The connection between Haskell and Pritchard became the focus of intense investigation. Records showed several phone calls between numbers associated with both men during the years the hotel was operating. There were also financial transactions, small amounts of money moving between accounts in ways that suggested payments for services rendered. But Edward Pritchard remained missing, and without him, many questions could not be answered. Then, nearly 18 months after the investigation had reopened, a hiker in Northern California discovered a wallet in a ravine near a hiking trail. The wallet contained identification for Edward Pritchard. Local authorities were called, and a search of the area located skeletal remains approximately 50 yards from where the wallet had been found. The remains were identified through dental records as Pritchard. The medical examiner determined that he had died from a gunshot wound to the head, and based on the condition of the body and weathering of the bones, death had occurred approximately 10 to 12 years prior. A rusted handgun was found near the body. The ruling was suicide, though investigators noted that it was impossible to be completely certain after so much time. What was clear was that Pritchard had died sometime around 2013, which aligned with when he had disappeared from all records. He had driven to a remote location and taken his own life, leaving behind no note, no explanation, no confession. His death meant they would never hear his version of events, never know exactly what role he had played in the crimes committed at the seaside inn. It was another door closing, another potential source of answers gone forever. The investigation refocused entirely on Raymond Haskell. He was now wanted not just for questioning but for multiple counts of murder. The evidence linking him to the seaside inn, combined with the remains found on the property, created a strong case even without direct witnesses. Years continued to pass. The task force was eventually disbanded as resources were redirected to active cases. Vaughn continued to work the investigation as time allowed, refusing to let it fade back into the cold case files. He maintained contact with the families, with Iris Chadwick, with anyone who could provide new information or perspective. Iris aged visibly over those years. Vaughn visited her once when he traveled to England for a law enforcement conference, and they sat in her small flat drinking tea while she showed him photographs of Marlowe as a child, as a teenager, as the bright young woman she had been. Iris spoke about the weight of not knowing where her niece's body rested, the inability to have a proper burial, the feeling that Marlowe was still out there somewhere waiting to be found. Vaughn promised he would not stop looking. It was a promise he knew might be impossible to keep, but he made it anyway because some promises mattered more than their likelihood of fulfillment. The breakthrough came from an unexpected direction. In 2022, 14 years after Marlowe's disappearance and 4 years after the investigation had reopened, a true crime podcast began covering the case. The podcast was thorough and respectful, interviewing investigators, playing audio from press conferences, discussing the evidence without sensationalizing it. The host made appeals for information, and the episodes were downloaded millions of times. Among the listeners was a woman named Sandra Voss who lived in British Columbia. She contacted the podcast with information she had been afraid to share for years. In 2008, she had been working as a nurse at a small clinic near the Canadian border. One night in late July, a man had brought in a woman who was injured and disoriented. The man claimed she was his wife, that she had fallen while hiking. The woman had not spoken, had seemed heavily sedated, and Sandra had felt something was wrong but had not acted on her instincts. The man had insisted on taking the woman home rather than admitting her to a hospital, and Sandra had reluctantly agreed after he became aggressive. She had never forgotten that night, the look in the woman's eyes, the sense that she was witnessing something terrible but did not know what to do. When she heard the podcast describe Marlo Fenwick's case, something clicked. She found photographs of Marlo online and became convinced that she had been the woman in the clinic that night. Sandra provided a detailed statement and worked with a sketch artist to create an image of the man who had brought the woman in. The sketch bore a strong resemblance to Raymond Haskell, though Sandra could not be completely certain after so many years. The clinic where Sandra had worked was approximately 200 miles north of the Seaside Inn, across the border into Canada. If Haskell had taken Marlo there, it suggested he had fled north after whatever had happened at the hotel, possibly trying to get her out of the United States before authorities connected her disappearance to his presence. Canadian authorities were contacted, and a joint investigation was launched. Records from the clinic were located and confirmed that a woman matching Marlo's description had been treated for unspecified injuries on July 23, 2008, exactly 1 week after she had disappeared. The patient record had listed a false name and had been paid for in cash. There was no follow-up, no indication of what had happened to the woman after she left. The investigation shifted north. Areas around the clinic were searched. Missing persons cases in British Columbia from that time period were reviewed. And slowly, a trail began to emerge. Sightings of a man matching Haskell's description traveling with a woman who seemed unwell, always moving, never staying anywhere for long, paying in cash, avoiding attention. The trail went cold in early August 2000 and ate near a remote area of wilderness known for its dense forests and difficult terrain. Search teams were deployed, though the passage of 14 years made finding anything nearly impossible. The forest had reclaimed whatever traces might have existed. Then, in a development that brought the case full circle back to where it had begun, a group of hikers exploring an area near Squamish discovered something lodged between rocks near a waterfall. It was a small waterproof camera, the kind travelers used in the early 2000s before smartphones became ubiquitous. The camera was damaged, but intact enough that the memory card inside was recoverable. The hikers, aware of the ongoing investigation due to podcast coverage, turned the camera over to the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. The memory card was sent to a forensic lab where specialists were able to retrieve some of the stored images despite water damage and age. The photographs were haunting in their ordinariness. They showed scenes from Portland, images clearly taken by a tourist documenting her trip, the lighthouse, the harbor, street musicians, sunset over the water. And in several of the photos, visible in the background, was a man who appeared to be following at a distance. The same man in multiple images over different days, always watching, never approaching. When the images were compared to photographs of Raymond Haskell, the match was undeniable. He had been stalking Marlo for days before her disappearance, learning her patterns, waiting for the right moment. The final photographs on the camera were different. They were blurred, taken in darkness, showing what appeared to be the interior of a vehicle and then trees passing by a window. The last image was of a night sky through branches, slightly out of focus, as if the camera had been dropped or hidden in haste. The metadata from the photographs provided timestamps. The last image had been taken on July 24, 2008. in a location that GPS coordinates placed approximately 30 miles northeast of where the camera had been found. A massive search operation was organized, concentrating on that area. Volunteers joined law enforcement, spreading out across difficult terrain, looking for any sign of what had happened to Marlo Fenwick in those final days. The search continued for weeks, hampered by weather and geography, driven by determination and the hope that after all these years, they might finally bring her home. And then they found her. Not where they had been searching, but along a riverbank 2 miles from the GPS coordinates, where seasonal flooding had exposed what had been buried beneath silt and stone. The remains were identified through DNA comparison with samples Iris had provided years earlier. Marlo Fenwick was finally found, 14 years after she had disappeared, thousands of miles from where anyone had thought to look. The medical examiner determined that cause of death could not be established with certainty due to the condition of the remains and the passage of time, but there was evidence consistent with drowning. Whether it had been accident, murder, or something else would never be fully known. Her body was released to Iris, who arranged for Marlo to be brought home to England for burial. The funeral was attended by investigators who had worked the case, including Vaughn, who had promised he would not stop looking and had kept that promise. Iris thanked them all, her voice steady despite her grief, and said that while the ending was not what she had hoped for, there was peace in finally having answers, in knowing that Marlo could rest. The search for Raymond Haskell continued. He remained at large, wanted for multiple murders, his photograph distributed worldwide. Tips continued to come in, but he was never found. Whether he was alive and hiding or had met his own end somewhere unknown, the outcome remained unresolved. But for Marlo Fenwick, the case was closed. Her story had been told, her final resting place was known, and the photograph that had appeared on that Tuesday afternoon, unremarkable in its arrival but devastating in its implications, had set in motion a chain of events that brought her home at last. The discovery of Marlo's remains in British Columbia closed one chapter, but opened another that Vaughn had not anticipated. Within 48 hours of the identification, his office began receiving calls from families across the Pacific Northwest, people who had spent years searching for daughters, sisters, mothers who had vanished under circumstances that shared echoes of Marlo's case. Each conversation was a reminder that closure for one family often meant renewed anguish for others still waiting. Vaughn sat in his office late one evening, the city lights of Portland stretching out beyond his window, and realized that the investigation had revealed something far larger than a single tragedy. The pattern of disappearances, the connection to the seaside inn, the evidence of Raymond Haskell's movements across multiple states and into Canada, all suggested a predator who had operated with careful deliberation for possibly decades. How many victims had there been? How many families would never have the answers that Iris Chadwick finally received? The task force had officially disbanded, but Vaughn found himself unable to walk away. He had become the institutional memory of the case, the person who understood how all the pieces connected, and he felt an obligation to see it through as far as it could go. He began compiling everything they had learned into a comprehensive database, cross-referencing missing persons cases with timelines and locations associated with Haskell and the properties owned by Edward Pritchard. The work was painstaking and often heartbreaking. For every possible connection he identified, there were families who had to be contacted, old wounds reopened, hopes raised and sometimes dashed. But there were also moments of resolution. A woman who had disappeared in 2003 near the Oregon-California border was tentatively connected to items found in a storage unit that had been rented by Haskell under an alias. Her family, who had spent 19 years without answers, finally had a direction to focus their grief. Detective Sarah Chen, who had been part of the original team that searched the Seaside Inn, continued working with Vaughn even as other investigators moved on to different assignments. She had developed an expertise in cold cases through this investigation, and found that she could not let go of the questions that remained. Together, they spent countless hours reviewing evidence, consulting with experts, following leads that often went nowhere but occasionally opened unexpected doors. One such door appeared when Chen was reviewing financial records that had been subpoenaed during the investigation into Pritchard's business dealings. She noticed a series of payments made to a private airstrip in eastern Oregon, transactions that had occurred regularly between 2005 and 2008. The payments had been categorized as business expenses, but there was no clear explanation for why a small coastal hotel would need regular access to a remote airstrip. Vaughn and Chen drove out to the location, a 4-hour journey through mountains and high desert that ended at a barely maintained runway surrounded by scrub grass and weathered buildings. The airstrip was still operational, run by an elderly man named Frank Dietrich who lived in a trailer on the property and supplemented his income by allowing private planes to refuel and park in his hangar. When shown photographs of Pritchard and Haskell, Dietrich's reaction was immediate. He remembered both men, though he had known them by different names. They had used his airstrip multiple times, always arriving in a small Cessna, always paying in cash, always keeping to themselves. He had assumed they were businessmen who valued privacy, possibly involved in something marginally legal, but nothing that seemed dangerous enough to report. What he told them next changed the scope of the investigation. On several occasions, Dietrich had seen them arrive with a passenger, always a woman, always someone who seemed disoriented or unwell. He had assumed these were clients or associates who had been drinking or were ill from the flight. It had not been his business to ask questions, and in the rural culture of eastern Oregon where privacy was respected above curiosity, he had looked the other way. Vaughn felt his chest tighten as he listened. The airstrip was less than an hour's flight from the Canadian border, a perfect route for someone wanting to move across international boundaries without going through official checkpoints. If Haskell had been taking victims into Canada by air, it explained how he had managed to transport Marlowe so far so quickly, and it suggested that others might have been moved the same way. Canadian authorities were contacted again with this new information. Flight records were subpoenaed, though the small airstrip's record-keeping had been minimal at best. What they did find was a registration for a Cessna that had been owned by a company traced back to one of Pritchard's business entities. The plane had been sold in 2009, right around the time everything connected to Pritchard began to dissolve. The new buyer had been a crop-dusting operation in Idaho that had used the plane for 3 years before retiring it. The plane had eventually been sold for parts, scattered across various owners, impossible to reassemble physically, but its history preserved in registration documents and maintenance records. Those records showed that in the years Pritchard had owned it, the plane had logged hundreds of hours of flight time, far more than would be needed for any legitimate business purpose for a small hotel. Chen constructed a map plotting the locations of unsolved disappearances against the range of the Cessna, and the timing of flights recorded in the fragmentary logs they had obtained. The overlay was chilling. Nearly every disappearance that matched the profile of Haskell's known victims fell within the flight radius of the airstrip, and several had occurred within days of documented flights. The evidence was circumstantial but compelling. It painted a picture of a carefully organized operation where Haskell had used Pritchard's resources, the anonymity of the Seaside Inn, the remote airstrip, and the vast wilderness of the Pacific Northwest and British Columbia to hunt and dispose of victims with a level of planning that had allowed him to evade detection for years. But circumstantial evidence, however persuasive, was not enough to close cases or bring charges without a defendant to prosecute. Raymond Haskell remained missing, and without him, the investigation existed in a state of incomplete resolution. Families had information but not justice. Questions had answers but not accountability. Vaughn struggled with this reality. He had become close with several of the families through the years of investigation, and he saw in their faces the same pain that Iris Chadwick had carried. They wanted someone to answer for what had been done to their loved ones. They wanted a trial, a sentence, a public acknowledgement of the evil that had stolen their daughters and sisters. Instead, they had a fugitive who might be dead, might be living under a new identity somewhere in the world, might never face the consequences of his actions. The frustration was compounded by the fact that Vaughn knew his time on the case was limited. He was approaching retirement age, and the department was already discussing succession plans. A younger detective, someone with fresh energy and perspective, would eventually take over the cold case unit. Vaughn would have to hand off the files, the relationships with families, the accumulated knowledge of years of work, and trust that whoever came next would maintain the same commitment. That reality became more immediate when Vaughn suffered a minor heart attack one evening while working late at the office. He had been reviewing witness statements for what felt like the 1,000th time when the pain started, radiating down his arm, tightening around his chest like a vice. He had the presence of mind to call for help before collapsing, and he woke up in a hospital room with doctors telling him that he had been fortunate, that the damage was minimal, but that he needed to make significant changes to his lifestyle and stress levels. The mandatory medical leave gave Vaughn time to reflect on what the case had meant to him and what he still hoped to accomplish. He realized that his pursuit of Raymond Haskell had become more than professional obligation. It had become personal in ways that were probably unhealthy, consuming hours that should have been spent with family, generating stress that had nearly killed him, binding his sense of worth to an outcome he could not control. During his recovery, Iris Chadwick came to visit. She had flown from England specifically to see him, a gesture that moved him deeply. They sat in his living room drinking tea, and she told him that Marlowe had been laid to rest in a small cemetery near the village where she had grown up, a place overlooking green fields where she had played as a child. The funeral had been beautiful, attended by friends from across the years who had never stopped wondering what had happened to her. Iris said that while the grief would never entirely fade, there was comfort in being able to visit a grave, in having a place where Marlowe existed again in the world rather than just in memory. She also told Vaughn something he needed to hear. She thanked him for everything he had done, for keeping his promise, for treating Marlowe as more than a case file. But she also released him from any further obligation. She said that Marlowe was home, that her story had been told, and that he had already given more than anyone could reasonably ask. Whether Raymond Haskell was ever found or not, whether justice was ever formally served or not, Vaughn had accomplished what mattered most. He had brought Marlowe back to the people who loved her. The word settled something in Vaughn that he had not realized was unsettled. He understood that he had been carrying guilt along with determination, a sense that if he just worked harder, searched longer, was clever enough, he could solve everything for everyone. But some things were beyond solving, some losses too profound to ever fully address. His job was not to fix the unfixable but to bear witness, to honor the victims by refusing to forget them, and to trust that his efforts mattered even when the outcomes were incomplete. When he returned to work 6 weeks later, he did so with a different perspective. He continued investigating, continued following leads as they emerged, but he also began preparing for transition. He started training a younger detective named Maya Reeves, walking her through the files, explaining the connections, introducing her to the families. Reeves was sharp and empathetic, someone who understood that cold cases were about more than solving puzzles. They were about people who deserved to have their stories heard. Together, Vaughn and Reeves worked on creating a comprehensive report documenting everything the investigation had uncovered. It was more than a case file. It was a record of lives interrupted, families shattered, a community's failure to protect its most vulnerable, and the long, difficult process of seeking truth across years and jurisdictions. The report was shared with law enforcement agencies across North America, providing a resource for anyone working similar cases, offering patterns and methodologies that might help identify predators before they accumulated victims. The report also contained a section that Vaughn considered the most important. It was a memorial to the known and suspected victims, pages dedicated to each woman with photographs, biographical information, descriptions of who they had been beyond the circumstances of their disappearance. Marlo Fenwick, the cultural anthropologist who loved jazz music and kept meticulous journals. Rebecca Solis, the graphic designer who volunteered at animal shelters. Jennifer Ames, the teacher who spent summers hiking and photographing wildlife. Each one had been a complete person, with dreams and relationships and futures that had been stolen. The document ended with a list of unsolved disappearances that shared characteristics with the known cases, women whose fates remained unknown, but who deserved to be remembered as part of the same story. It was Vaughn's way of acknowledging that even after years of work, they had probably only found a fraction of the truth, and that the silence around these cases represented failures that could not be corrected but could perhaps be learned from. As his official retirement date approached, Vaughn found himself thinking often about the moment he had first seen the photograph from the Urban Exploration Forum, that image of a dusty corridor with Marlo's belongings barely visible in the background. It had seemed like such a small thing, a random post on an obscure corner of the internet, and yet it had unraveled 14 years of silence. It reminded him that truth had a way of surfacing eventually, that secrets could only be buried so deep before erosion or accident or simple chance brought them back into light. The retirement ceremony was small, attended by colleagues and a few of the families he had worked with over the years. Iris sent a video message that was played at the gathering, thanking Vaughn one final time and saying that while she had lost her niece, she had gained an understanding that there were still people in the world who believed in justice and compassion. The words were simple, but they carried weight, validation that the years had meant something. After he left the department, Vaughn found himself with time to reflect on what the case had taught him about human nature. He thought about Raymond Haskell and the mystery of how someone could look so ordinary while harboring such darkness. He thought about Edward Pritchard and the moral compromises that had allowed him to profit from others' suffering, until the weight of it drove him to a ravine in California. He thought about all the small decisions that people had made, witnesses who had not spoken up, staff who had looked the other way, systems that had failed to connect obvious patterns because jurisdictions did not communicate effectively. But he also thought about the people who had chosen differently. Garrett, the urban explorer who could have kept silent but instead reported what he had found. Sandra Voss, the nurse who had carried guilt for years but finally came forward with information. Iris Chadwick, who had never stopped believing her niece deserved to be found. Detective Chen, who had given years of her career to seeking justice for people she had never met. Frank Dietrich, who eventually testified about what he had seen despite his cultural inclination toward privacy. These were the counterweights to the darkness, the reason Vaughn could look back on the case without despair. For every person who had enabled evil through action or inaction, there were others who had chosen to stand in opposition even when it was difficult or costly. That balance was what allowed justice to eventually emerge, however imperfectly, however late. Maya Reeves called him occasionally with updates on developments in the ongoing search for Raymond Haskell. There had been reported sightings in Mexico, in Southeast Asia, in Eastern Europe. though none had been confirmed. Interpol kept the case active, and Haskell's photograph remained on wanted lists, but as years passed, the likelihood of finding him diminished. Reeves admitted frustration with this reality, and Vaughn counseled patience, reminding her that their work had value regardless of whether Haskell was ever caught. They had given families answers, identified victims who might otherwise have remained nameless, created a record that would help future investigations. On the 15th anniversary of Marlowe's disappearance, a memorial was held in Portland at the park, overlooking the harbor where she had spent her afternoons journaling. The event was organized by a victims' rights group and attended by families from across the region, people connected by loss and the difficult journey toward healing. Vaughn attended along with many of the investigators who had worked the case. Iris had wanted to come, but health concerns prevented her from traveling, so she sent a letter that was read aloud. In the letter, Iris described what the 15 years had been like for her, the not knowing that had been worse than grief because it had prevented closure, the relief and renewed pain that had come with finally learning Marlowe's fate, and the slow process of integrating that knowledge into a life that had been forever altered. She talked about returning to the things Marlowe had loved, listening to jazz, visiting museums, reading the anthropology texts her niece had studied, as a way of keeping her present. She said that Marlowe had believed deeply in the importance of stories, of documenting human experience, of understanding how people lived and what they valued. The investigation that had found her had honored that belief by refusing to let her story be forgotten. The memorial included a plaque installed on a bench overlooking the water, inscribed with Marlowe's name and the dates of her life, along with a quote from her journal about finding beauty in small moments. It was a permanent marker in the landscape she had loved during her final days of freedom, a place where anyone who wanted to remember her could sit and watch the sea. As Vaughn sat on that bench after the ceremony ended, watching the light change on the water, he thought about all the places Marlowe had been carried over the years. From that boardwalk where she had listened to music, to the seaside inn where someone had imprisoned her, north across the border into Canada, through forests and along rivers, finally to a grave in England overlooking fields of green. Her physical journey had been one of violence and tragedy, but her story had traveled differently, through investigation reports and news articles, podcast episodes and memorial services, touching people who had never met her but who recognized in her fate something that mattered. That was what survived when everything else was taken, not just the facts of what happened, but the meaning people made from those facts, the connections formed, the changes inspired. Marlowe's disappearance had led to reforms in how missing persons cases were handled, improvements in communication between jurisdictions, increased resources for investigating stranger abductions. Her story had prompted other victims' families to come forward with information they had been too frightened or uncertain to share. The investigation into her death had potentially prevented future crimes by exposing methodologies and patterns that made it harder for predators to operate undetected. These were not small things. They would not bring Marlowe back or erase what she had suffered, but they represented the stubborn human insistence on creating light from darkness, on transforming tragedy into purpose. Vaughn had spent enough years in law enforcement to know that justice was often incomplete, and that closure was more aspiration than achievement. But he had also learned that the effort mattered, that the act of witnessing and remembering and refusing to accept silence was itself a form of resistance against the forces that sought to erase vulnerable people from the world. As the sun set over the harbor, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that Marlowe had once photographed and described in her journal, Vaughn felt the weight of the case finally begin to lift from his shoulders. He had done what he promised. Others would continue the work. And somewhere in the accumulated efforts of everyone who had touched this investigation, there was something that approximated justice, imperfect and incomplete but real nonetheless. He walked back through the town as evening settled in, past the places Marlowe had visited on her last free day, the streets that had once been part of a mystery and were now just streets again. The Seaside Inn had been demolished the previous year, the property finally cleared after all the investigations concluded. Someone would probably build something new there eventually, and whatever happened on that land would be unknowing of the darkness it had once held. That was perhaps for the best. Places did not need to be haunted forever by what had occurred within them, but memory persisted in other ways. In the database Vaughn and Reeves had created, accessible to investigators across the continent, in the families who gathered each year to remember, in the reforms that made future investigations more effective, in the simple fact that Marlowe's story had been told completely and truthfully, that her life had been honored not just in its ending but in its wholeness. Years later, when Vaughn was much older and someone asked him about the case that had defined the final decade of his career, he would talk about the photograph that had started everything, that image of a forgotten corridor in an abandoned building. He would explain how something so small had contained within it the power to unravel years of silence, to bring a young woman home, to give families the answers they had stopped believing they would receive. And he would say that it reminded him of something essential about the work of seeking justice. That truth had weight and persistence, that it could not be buried permanently, that eventually, through the accumulated efforts of people who refused to look away, light found its way into even the darkest places. The story of Marlowe Fenwick did not end with resolution or capture or closure in any final sense. It ended with remembering, with the choice to keep bearing witness, with the understanding that some questions would remain unanswered, and that this too was part of the truth. She had been a woman who loved music and travel, and the careful documentation of human experience. She had been taken by someone who saw her as less than human. And she had been brought home by people who saw her as fully human, who believed that her story mattered enough to pursue across years and jurisdictions, and all the obstacles that time erected. That was the legacy. Not perfect justice, not complete closure, but the stubborn insistence that every person matters, that every story deserves to be told, that the work of remembering and witnessing and seeking truth is never wasted even when the outcomes are incomplete. In a world where people disappeared and evil operated in shadows and systems failed, there were still those who would search, who would care, who would refuse to let silence be the final word. And sometimes, in the space between what was lost and what was found, there emerged something like grace,